Hello, guys and gals, and this is part 37 of our reading of Rod Serling's Twilight Zone 26 Unforgettable Explorations into the Realm of the Supernatural, adapted by Walter B. Gibson. And as always, we will be going over the copyright information, and that should be on your screen right now. And it says Rod Serling's The Twilight Zone is copyright 1963 by Cayuga Productions Incorporated. Rod Serling's Twilight Zone Revisited is copyright 1964 by Cayuga Productions Incorporated. All rights reserved. This 1983 edition is published by Bonanza Books, distributed by Outlet Book Company, Incorporated, Random House Company, and the address is there. This book was previously published as two separate works entitled Rod Serling's The Twilight Zone and Rod Serling's Twilight Zone Revisited, printed and bound in the United States of America, and all the Library of Congress information is there if you want it. And we are going to get back to this. Anyways, Silent John is dead. There was a steamer ship. It destroyed the Dixie Belle, and so all we know is that John died, and it was really weird. We're going to continue where we left off. We're going to start the previous paragraph. A month after the funeral, Hiram Moreland was seated in his upstairs parlor on another foggy night. Again, the town hall clock struck 8, snapping Hiram from his reverie. Then, as he dozed off again gradually, he awoke suddenly to see his brother John standing beside him. This time John was silent, but his gaze was reproachful, and he made no effort to unfold his arms and extend his hand to Hiram. Nor was John's face all gory as it had been on that fatal night. He was the old John, whom Hiram remembered from former dreams, but the reproachful air was something new. From then on, John's wraith appeared to Hiram at intervals of every few weeks, and at odd hours during the night. Whenever Hiram happened to wake up, Hiram soon became conditioned to the apparition's accusing stare. But each morning he woke up worried about what might happen the next time. Why should there always be such silence? If John's ghost had a question, why didn't he ask it? Hiram could only conclude that perhaps he was the one supposed to ask the question, but what could it be about? Hiram never mentioned any of this to Esther because he did not want to disturb her. But one evening, when she and Hiram were waiting on the porch for Terry to hitch the buggy and drive Hiram back to town, Esther suddenly exclaimed, "Don't stand there, Hiram, with your arms folded and your face so solemn and reproachful. It seems that if instead of looking at you, I'm seeing John. I don't like it." Esther broke off and added sadly, "I should have said that. Forgive me. I shouldn't have said that. Forgive me, Hiram. Or maybe I should ask John to forgive me when I see him again." "You see him too, Esther?" Hiram asked anxiously. "Standing like this, saying nothing?" "I've seen him half a dozen times, Hiram," his sister replied. "John tried to get some message through to us that night he died, but he didn't manage it. We're still seeing him in our minds, Hiram, because we know there is unfinished business." "To finish it," decided Hiram, "we must find out more about it. I think I'll take a vacation, Esther, and go along to New Orleans and see that young pilot John used to mention in his letters. What was his name, do you remember?" "Dave Shelby." Esther went inside and rummaged in a desk drawer. "Here is the letter he wrote us himself after John died." She handed the letter to Hiram, who had followed her in. "Read it, Hiram." It was, for the most part, a letter of heartfelt condolence, but it contained one statement that particularly impressed Hiram Moreland. "If only I had been with the chief before he died. He mentioned you often, and I am sure he would have given me a message for you when I was on my way up to the pilot house. I felt that he needed me there, so I hurried, but the crash came first. He was either dying or dead when I found him. He could not speak. I was too late." "Too late," repeated Hiram. "That's what John said to both of us. It was too late to save him." Hiram noted the letterhead, which bore the name of the hotel um, Bontazin in New Orleans. I'll find young Shelby and talk to him. A few weeks later, David Shelby came into New Orleans from a trip upriver and registered at the Hotel Bontazin. As Dave went into a little restaurant adjoining the hotel, the desk clerk nodded to a solemn-faced man who was reading a newspaper in the corner of the lobby. The man got up, followed Dave into the cafe, and sat down opposite him. Then he put the quiet query. "Are you Dave Shelby?" When Dave looked up, his eyes went wide, for he believed he saw the face of silent John Morland gazing into his own. "Chief," Dave gulped, "you're back. You're alive. But you can't be." Even as he stared, Dave expected the figure to fade away. Instead, it stayed, and the voice spoke again. "I am Hiram Morland." Understanding dawned on Dave Shelby. He had always pictured Hiram as looking like his brother John, but he had never expected so close a resemblance. Silent John had become such a tradition of the Mississippi that he was regarded as unique, but Hiram was the image of his dead brother. Even in his black coat, plain shirt front, and old-style stovepipe hat. "Tell me," Hiram said earnestly, "about the night my brother died. My sister and I want to know every detail." A deeper understanding dawned on Dave now. "You heard from Silent John that night?" "My sister and I both did," returned Hiram. "He called to us from the fog, as he had before." "I know," Dave nodded. "He told me about those other times. I figured he might have tried to reach you again. He excuse me. He did. I heard a clock strike 8 and the exact time of the collision. I dozed a few minutes, or maybe longer, and then John was there and talking to me, saying that he was dying and needed help from others. Needed help for others. I wouldn't know exactly when I saw him because it was nearly 8:30 before I was really awake." Pausing, Hiram noted the eagerness on Dave's face. From his pocket, Hiram brought the detailed report that he had written from Esther's account of John's ghostly visitation. "My sister's experience tallies with mine," Hiram said, "or I might say mine confirms hers. But she sensed things that were happening in the pilot house and along the river, such as voices, music, steamboat whistles." Dave nodded a quick interruption as he started his finger down Hiram's list, but his forehead wrinkled in a puzzled frown as he stated, "You heard the clock strike 8, and your sister's dream began about that time. First she heard voices, then the sound of the music?" "Oh, yes, oh, Susanna coming from a showboat." "That's the time the Calliope was playing, sure enough." Dave's puzzlement increased. But it was at Bonneville 10 minutes before the crash. The steamboat whistles were later. Then came the Colossus. But why did your sister hear them after 8 o'clock? "Why not?" Hiram responded with a shrug. "It was after 8 when I heard John say that he was dying." "But he was already dead by 8 o'clock, insisted Dave. "All these things your sister sensed were true enough, but they happened sooner. Wait now, 8 o'clock. What time does your town go on?" "Why, Indianapolis time." "That's it." Dave's face shone grim satisfaction as he pulled a printed sheet from his pocket. "We're always getting mixed on time. Indianapolis time. Let's see. It's 17 minutes earlier than St. Louis time, which we use as river time, all the way down the Mississippi." Now Hiram understood these were the days before the nation had been divided into time zones. Such an arrangement had never been heard of, perhaps not even imagined. Each large city has its own time, calculated exactly by sunrise and sunset. This sun time, as they called it, was absolutely correct. Steamboats, railroads, even stagecoaches used the sun time of the city where they started, and this was accepted as standard by towns along the line. Hence the clocks in Newbury, which were by Indianapolis time, were just 17 minutes ahead of those using Mississippi River time. 17 minutes to 8. Dave asserted. That's just about when the Dixie Belle stopped at Cedar Landing, and we took on a passenger. That's when your sister heard voices. Dave studied Hiram's list, and then bells. Musingly, Dave thought back, then suddenly exclaimed, I have it! Checking Esther's account that Hiram had so carefully written down, Dave added data of his own to interpret it step by step. Silent John had ordered a gambler named Matt Kiley to be put ashore at Cedar Landing, Dave said. Matt was up on the Texas deck, and he must have gone to the pilot house while Silent John was sitting there, looking out into the fog and thinking of home. Your sister Esther was already sensing that impression when Matt barged into the pilot house to start an argument. It must have been Matt's voice your sister heard saying, Now listen to me, Moreland. Then she recognized the voice of Silent John, but he didn't say, I'll settle this matter right now. As she thought, what Silent John must have said was, I'll settle this, Matt, right now. Do you follow? Hiram nodded. That's when the clatter started. Now I can picture just what happened. Dave pressed his hand to his eyes and continued. Matt must have grabbed the stool and hit the chief with it, because why should the stool have been broken if he hadn't? Silent John maybe tried to ward him off with the poker. That's why it was lying by his hand, but he didn't have a chance. Matt slugged him down and left him dying. Then, to cover his tracks, Matt rang the engine room and raced down through the Texas, grabbing his bag on the way. But in that case, objected Hiram, the Dixie Belle would have been getting underway by the time Matt reached the stern deck. She was, Dave exclaimed, but they were taking it slow in the engine room. They generally do when there's a yawl alongside. There would have been time for us to call in from the deck and have them stop the engines in an emergency. Anyway, Matt got off in a hurry, and now we know why. Silent John must have been lying in the pilot house moaning while the Dixie Belle went by the showboat in Bonneville when he heard the whistle of the Colossus coming upriver. He must have gathered strength enough to cry for help, not for himself, but for all the rest of us aboard the Dixie Belle, seeing as she was steaming full speed for a head-on crash. The anguished cry had been projected mentally far beyond the confines of the pilot house of the Dixie Belle, to the only person who could have recognized it, John's brother Hiram and sister Esther. But they had been too distant to help. Now, as Hiram Moreland weighed those facts, Dave Shelby felt himself amid a silence as deep as any he had ever experienced in the presence of Silent John. Finally, Hiram broke the spell with a calm query. Where can we find Matt Kiley? Up in Natchez, replied Dave, probably itching to get away like most of the gamblers there. But they don't like to travel on cheap packets, and good ones won't take them as passengers. You're piloting a good packer now? The Lone Star, one of the finest on the river. Couldn't word be gotten to Matt Kiley, saying he might slip on board the Lone Star, unrecognized or unnoticed? Hiram's tone was very solemn, very like his dead brother's. Dave felt as if it were an order from Silent John himself. I'll fix it through the deckhand on the Diana, he promised. She pulls out today, but we don't leave until tomorrow. When the Lone Star did pull out, Hiram Moreland was one of her passengers, but he kept close in his cabin, rather than have crew members note his resemblance to his brother John. The Lone Star reached the cliffs of Natchez the next afternoon and was promptly approached by a group of flashily dressed men from a section called Natchez Under the Hill, which lay below the bluffs and was notorious for its gambling hangouts. None of these gentry was taken on board, but amid the turmoil, a man with a bearing of a Mississippi planter pushed his way up the gangplank and was bowed on board by a polite steward who greeted him as Colonel Bateson. Not a flicker of a smile showed on the pretended colonel's face. Instead, he remained suave to the tips of his mustache and his pointed goatee. Everything had been quote-unquote fixed very neatly. The deckhand from the Diana had visited Natchez under the hill and had singled out Matt Kiley from Dave's description. He had started a chance quote-unquote conversation with Matt and had confided that for a special fee he could provide Matt with a password that would enable him to board the Lone Star and take passage up the river. Fortunately, Matt appeared to be in the money, and he had taken up the deal. The password was Colonel Bateson, and by answering to that name, Matt was shown to a cabin on the Lone Star, where the steward waited long enough to be paid his share of the quote-unquote fix before the packet pulled away from the dock. In Matt's estimation, the price was picayune compared to the opportunity of trimming the honest card players on board the Lone Star, which he could readily do in his false capacity of a Southern colonel. Matt Kiley knew how to play such parts to perfection. He still wore his poker face when he entered the steamboat's gilded social hall soon after dinner. There he paused at a card table and was promptly invited to take a chair and join a friendly game. Matt did so, with just the proper show of reluctance. A few hands of stud poker were dealt, and Matt had won his first pot, a small one. When he began to take stock of his fellow players, then Matt's hard features froze. For the first time, he really noted the face of a player across the table, a man who until now had kept his chin down in his hand while he surveyed his cards. Matt stared incredulously. Silent John Moreland. The fact that this was the poker table, which in life Silent John had shunned, made Matt all the more convinced that the pilot of the Dixie Belle had come back from the dead to haunt him. When the man looked up, Matt noted his plain shirt and black coat. Not only that, Matt felt the bore of eyes that seemed to stare right through him, as those of Silent John had stared. For the first time in his gambling career, Matt wanted to quit a game in its early stages, but he couldn't. He was literally paralyzed except for his hands, which were so used to shuffling and dealing cards that they were through the motions mechanically. But as hand after hand went by and the stakes became higher and higher, Matt found his luck deserting him in the very game that he had always regarded as his meat, stud poker. Outside, a rising fog had enveloped the Lone Star, but Dave Shelby in the pilot house was keeping steadily upstream along the Louisiana shore when the whistle blared a repeated warning. It's along about here that the Dixie Belle cracked into the Colossus nigh onto a year ago. One of the poker players commented dryly, That's why you hear those whistles. A lot of good they did, the Dixie Belle," put in another player, and added, "Some river folks say they've seen her coming downstream like a ghost ship on foggy nights like this." Matt Kiley, staring straight across the table, looked for some change in expression on the face that so resembled Silent John's. None came. Instead, the solemn man announced, "It's your deal, Colonel." Matt dealt already. He had lost a few $1,000s, and they had taken from other gamblers in Natchez under the hill. Now he was betting his own funds heavily, card after card, until his hand showed 2 aces and 2 sevens, all face up, with a 5th card turned down as a hole card. As was customary in stud poker, only one other player was still in the pot, the man who looked like Silent John. He had 3 nines showing with a 5 as his other face-up card. Matt pushed his last $1,000 to the center of the table and announced, "I'll bet the limit on my 2 pair aces up." They call that the dead man's hand," came the solemn tone from across the table. "I'll raise 1,000 on my 3 nines." "You'll have to call," said Matt. "That's all I have." "I would be glad to accept your note, Colonel, if you should happen to lose." Despite the tension, Matt started to smile, which he quickly repressed. "Thank you, sir. I'll call you, then," he declared. "My whole card is the ace of spades." Matt turned it up. "And I win with a full house. 3 aces, 2 sevens. The ace of spades is called the card of death," came the solemn tone, so like Silent John's. "In this case, it is a sudden death to your hopes, Colonel. I win with 4 nines." With that, Hiram Moreland turned up his whole card and showed the 4th 9. While Hiram was raking in the money, Matt Kiley called for pen and paper and asked, "How do you want me to write out your note?" "Like this," Hiram replied. He just said, "I, Matt Kiley, hereby acknowledge that—" Hiram paused. Matt had fallen into the trap of writing down his own name instead of Colonel Bateson. Hiram's voice continued, "That I assaulted and killed John Moreland, pilot of the Dixie Belle, and signaled for full speed." "You can't pin that on me," Matt snarled. "Nobody was there. Nobody except you and John Moreland. First you said, 'Now listen to me, Moreland.' Then John Moreland answered, just as I am answering now. I'll settle this, Matt, right now." That was enough if any man ever believed that he was faced by a living ghost. And that man was Matt Kiley. "So I killed you," snarled Matt. "Now get back where you belong, back on the wreck of the Dixie Belle." Matt was recoiling, betraying his fear of a vengeful ghost. But the other men at the table, none of whom had ever met Silent John, took a more practical view. They had recognized the name of Matt Kiley as that of a notorious gambler who now was admitting murder as another of his crimes. "Grab him," one man barked. "Don't let him get away." Matt already was away, racing out through the main saloon until he reached the very bow of the boiler deck. There he wheeled, confronting his pursuers with an antique pepper-box pistol, a weapon with 6 barrels, clumsy to fire but deadly at close range. "If anyone draws a gun," snapped Matt, "I'll shoot him. Get back, all of you. I'm looking for a ghost to find out if he's real." The group scattered wildly, and Hiram, who had followed closely behind them, was suddenly an open target. Matt's face gleamed a demonic fury. With that, Matt pressed his finger. With that, Matt paused, his finger halting on the trigger. He was utterly paralyzed by Hiram's reaction. "I killed you once. Now it will be twice." Despite the imminence of Matt's gun, Hiram's eyes were staring beyond him. So were the other men crouched along the deck. Their horror was so sudden, so real, that Matt, though he did not turn, could not resist a quick look over his shoulder. Matt saw what was looming out of the fog was the steamboat, the size of the Matt saw what they saw looming out of the fog was a steamboat the size of the Lone Star, about to meet the packet bow to bow. It was the same sort of crash that Matt had escaped when he had sent the Dixie Belle to her fate. Now, at the very bow of the Lone Star, he would be the first victim when the collision came. Not Matt Kiley. With a sideward spring, he cleared the rail of the Lone Star and hit the river, flinging away his gun as he tried to swim clear of the crash with mad, quick strokes. But in those same brief moments, the menace itself was gone. The bulking shape of the approaching steamboat dissolved into the mist like a phantom image. Fog, moonlight, and flares from the smokestacks of the Lone Star had produced a strange illusion that was no more solid than the mist itself. That didn't help Matt Kiley. As the Lone Star plowed on despite the clang of bells from the pilot house. The curved side of the steamboat stretched towards the swimming gambler. Then the paddle box was upon him. Then a shriek. Matt vanished under the sweep of a 30-foot wheel that churned its way over him. Behind the Lone Star lay a bubbly wake, with no sign of Matt Kiley. That wasn't surprising. Those paddles have a way of mangling their victims and mingling them deep in the Mississippi mud. I'm going to stop it here. I think we're almost done with this one. Yeah. We only have like a page left, but okay. Anyways, we've been reading from Rod Serling's Twilight Zone, 26 Unforgettable Explorations into the Realm of the Supernatural, adapted by Walter P. Gibson, and we've been reading The Ghost of the Dixie Belle. I think we will finish that up next time. Anyways, if you like this content, make sure you like and subscribe and ring the bell so you know when I upload. And if you want to support me in any way, all that information, and if you want to join the Discord server, all the information will be in the description below. And as always, thanks for watching, everyone, and have a great day.